Actor and film reviewer Robert Bellissimo is at the forefront of online film criticism. For in depth discourse on movies and interviews with industry professionals, follow his YouTube channel, Robert Bellissimo at the Movies, and contribute to his Patreon. Robert Bellissimo, welcome to Behind the Flicks.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
I really appreciate you making the time. You know, as soon as you commented on my Instagram post saying great interview with Joe McBride, I was like, hit the big time, you know. So that was a real thrill to hear that comment. So thank you.
Oh, I'm flattered. I certainly wouldn't consider myself anywhere near the big time. So
Before we move further with this interview, I want to make sure I got something right. You're an actor and a film reviewer.
That's right. Yeah.
My first big question is: does your work in acting inform your work in film criticism, vice versa?
Yeah, certainly. Because I think when you're an actor, you're first and foremost concerned with the character you're playing, and the more characters you play and the more you study the craft of acting, the more you're studying humanity and people and what motivates people. And so when I initially started to review movies, my early reviews, I talked mostly about characters.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course I've built on that because I think before I didn't always necessarily have the language to talk about the style of the film or the cinematography or the writing. And so I've been trying to study and get better and better at that as well. But yeah, everything to me initially was about the characters, and that really still to this day informs so much of my criticism by being able trying to make a judgment call on the behavior I'm seeing and the possible motivations behind why these characters are doing what they're doing and the contradictions and things like that. And I always gravitate towards films where it's challenging and complex from a character point of view. So yeah, it certainly has, acting is like the foundation through everything else, whether it's film criticism, whether it be a written review or like what you and I are doing right now, basically a conversation, a review via a podcast, have a conversation. And I teach acting as well, so that of course did it. So they all kind of inspire one another. To me, they're all like they all mesh and influence one another.
I entered into films when I was like 8 years old, like being fascinated by Star Wars and Indiana Jones, the big action epic kind of things. How'd you get into this mess of filmmaking and the film world? Because it is a mess and it's an uncertain industry. What was the film that got you into all this?
Well, for me, initially, because when I was in high school, that's when I started to get more interested in movies, and I was always attracted to the characters who were rough and tough, and so I like gangster movies or crime stories. And when I look back, I think it's because I mean, I guess that's common with young men, like they're attracted to sort of rough characters. But I think in my case, I maybe thought that I maybe felt that I wasn't as tough as I'd like to have been. So I sort of was
right there with your partner.
Yeah, right. There you go. We can relate. And so I was attracted to that, and I had a friend. I don't know how often people lend movies to each other, because that used to be a big thing, where people, I'll lend you my copy, and I mean now we buy those things because they're of course they're always works of art, but now they're like little film courses, right? So I don't know how I don't know how much people want to lend movies anymore, but he lent me Scarface and Casino and Goodfellas and movies like that, and Donnie Brasco, and so of course, I mean, it's like a cliche, like people get attracted to Pacino and De Niro and the Scorsese movies, and then of course I saw the Godfather trilogy, and so that got me really interested. And then I was really interested in De Niro. And in 2003, the AFI did a tribute to De Niro, and I watched it, and I saw all these various clips from his movies, like Mean Streets and Godfather 2 and Taxi Driver, and I thought he's so different in each movie. And I thought, how does he do that? And I was really interested in the way in which he transformed himself. And so I then had an opportunity in school to be in a play which was called A Night at the Oscars. So it was Academy Award winning scenes.
Incredible.
And it was actually a musical, but they asked the drama department to do scenes, dramatic or comedic scenes from Oscar winning movies. So I tried out, and I got asked, I got in, and the drama teacher, was a big inspiration for me. I went to him and I said, can we do a scene from Raging Bull? Could we do a scene from The Godfather? And and he was open to everything, and I just showed him the scenes, and he was like, okay. So we did a scene from The Godfather, we did a scene from Raging Bull, and I was beginning to find something I really, really love to do, and to really obsess with and channel all my energy into. And at the same time, I liked the attention I was getting for it from other kids, and and people were saying, oh, you should pursue this. And then again, also just being able to act tough on stage. And because those were, again, like I said, qualities I felt I lacked, but yet I was able to do it in a way which was creative and safe. And it went from there. And then, of course, I went to acting school after high school. And then I started working in the business here in Toronto, and I lived in London for England for a couple of years, and I worked out there. And then I came back in 2012. And so, yeah, that's how my acting career got going. But even in high school, because I was finding I was really liking movies a lot, I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a filmmaker or an actor. And I ultimately chose to go the acting route. And I did, from time to time, I made a few short films, and I directed a play. But I was always all about the acting. And when I was in my late 20s, I started to feel this different creative energy I had, which I didn't know where to channel it. And then I started blogging and writing. And then when COVID hit, the idea for a YouTube channel with a friend came up. And then I kind of realized that, I think this was maybe something that I wasn't aware of in my late teens, that was, in a way, is like a middle ground between filmmaking and acting for me, which is like film criticism, because you're talking about the acting, you're exploring the acting and the filmmaking, but obviously in a different way. And so, like I said, everything, acting and criticism and all these things, are an extension of that initial foundation. So that's how I got going and kind of going around the bases. And it's always exciting for me to see, because I didn't necessarily pick these things to happen. They just happened. The universe just brought me there. So that's generally how things have gone for me.
I can certainly see the acting, sort of that kind of acting quality of those films in Going Down the Road.
Yes.
Which is the film you picked for this episode of Behind the Flicks. Can you, in your own words, describe the film, the premise, the log line, anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's about these two young men in their early 30s. So I mean, they're young, but
yeah,
especially then not considered that young. And they're from Cape Breton in Nova Scotia, which is the Maritimes here. And they want to move to the big city, Toronto. And they have these dreams to do something different, but they don't necessarily know what that is, but they just have a yearning to explore something about life that they can't quite put into words, and they don't know exactly what it is, but they want to go and find out. And so they go to Toronto, and of course, things don't go so well. So I mean, that's generally what it's about. I mean, it's really
Yeah.
sort of about failed dreams, and I think also politically speaking, one could say it's an examination of the Canadian dream, which is essentially very much what the American dream is, and sort of it's an examination and somewhat of a criticism of that way of that way of thinking to an extent, and a story of friendship at the same time. But it's that's basically what that's the basic log line of the film.
Why did you pick Going Down the Road for this episode?
Well, for one thing, outside of just the film, is Canadian cinema. I ignored Canadian movies for up until 2020. Up until I started my YouTube channel, um, and I think even if you went on the street, I live in Toronto. If you went out on the street of Toronto and you asked most people what's your favorite Canadian film, they couldn't name one. And so it we have I actually did an interview with this film critic here, Jeff Pavir, who's very well versed in Canadian cinema. And it's all we really kind of went through the history of Canadian film, and why the English speaking Canadian cinema has struggled in a variety of ways. And it just dawned on me, why we have this way of thinking where our movies are inferior to Americans, and that they're not that good. So there's this way of thinking here where people will say, if they know it's a Canadian film, they may say, well, I don't want to see it because it's quote unquote so Canadian, which really is like a code word for bad in my view. And I've come to realize that the reason people think this way is because, even here, from, the time movies have started, what Canadians have been used to consuming are American movies, Hollywood movies. And so when they see just even in terms of picture quality, that something is like MGM or what have you, Paramount, Warner Brothers, like that,
the golden age,
the golden age, beautiful photography, and then they look at something like Going Down the Road, which is very rough and 16 millimeter. They just think, oh well, this is not as good, because of the image. Now, if you go ask like film people like you and I, obviously we don't have that way of thinking. But it really is because of that. I mean, we have smaller budgets here. We've struggled to have our own industry, the English speaking industry. It's different in Quebec. The French Canadian, they've had a lot more luck out there, and they had their own new wave. But we've really struggled with that, which is sort of a long story. But a lot of it is because of the influence of Hollywood, people being used to that kind of storytelling, and so and then of course now Toronto and Vancouver and cities like that are considered Hollywood North, meaning that they film so much stuff in Canada in Hollywood. So I'm sorry, in Toronto. So we basically use these cities in order to hide who we actually are. Toronto is disguised as Chicago or New York, and things like that. So it's great, I mean, if you want to work in film and television here on a crew, I mean, it's fantastic. And but if you want to be a filmmaker, it's a different battle, so I always try to shine a light on Canadian films, and I've noticed even among even cinephiles don't really know a lot about Canadian film. I mean, the Sight and Sound poll from 2022, 3 movies were Canadian,
Mm.
and which is an improvement because I looked through the various polls since '62, and none of the Canadian films were on there. A way to put it into context is that if you like, French New Wave, and if you like people like Cassavetes, that rough documentary approach, then you'll love a lot of these Canadian movies from the 60s and 70s, like Going Down the Road. So that was partly why I chose it, was just to keep shining a light on these really good films that have been made here. If again, if you know about Canadian movies, you'll know Going Down the Road. But if you don't know Canadian movies, you won't know it. But this is out of all the Canadian films I've seen, this is by far my favorite. So that's a big reason why I wanted to talk about it today.
I have to admit, I don't know a ton about Canadian cinema, and so I should correct that problem. And thank you for introducing me to this new world, new country of cinema. So thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Well, you're not alone. I mean, there is actually only one guy. He's a film historian, Daniel Kremer, and he's from the States, and he wrote a book on Cine Fury, who is someone who left Canada to go to America, which, like Norman Jewison. I mean, most of our talent who is famous left to go there to find and found, fame and success. And he wrote a book on Cine Fury, the filmmaker Cine Fury, who did you might know, like, the Ipcris File with Michael Caine. He's done a number of well-known films, and he knows a lot about Canadian movies, and he's really the only one, even among cinephiles. So it's very interesting to me that it's just a country that hasn't necessarily had a lot of exposure even to criticism, film criticism, with the exception of a few cases. But so yeah, I mean, I'm curious to hear what you thought of the film, and what we can talk about it in depth. I'm sure we will, anyways.
It's so funny you mentioned Cassavetes earlier. I specifically wrote down here Cassavetes, if you can see that.
Oh wow!
So
there you go.
You hit the nail right on the head. Here's what I admire most about the movie. It is definitely in the same vein as Cassavetes, I would say. Representing, it's rough around the edges and been very much a portrait of characters, which is, I feel like, exactly what you described. And it's very much geared towards representing a sort of realism. Movies are obviously not real by their nature, but they can represent reality.
Yeah. Right.
Do you think that's a fair assessment? Am I on the right track?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Donald Chabib, who was the director of this film, he was a documentary filmmaker.
Oh, really?
And so you see the documentary approach, and a lot of the filmmakers who went into narrative filmmaking at this time were documentary filmmakers, because they all worked for the National Film Board of Canada, which was financed by the government in the late 30s, which primary focus was to make documentaries about Canada, or short subject features about Canada. And so at this time, them and also the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, they started making narrative films, and so that's why you see a real documentary observational approach, because they're approaching it as realistically as they can. And so sometimes you sometimes can't even tell whether this is a documentary or not. There's non-professionals. Some of those scenes, I can't help but wonder if they just caught those things.
Yeah.
Like when they're interacting with some of those homeless guys in the park.
Yeah.
I would love to know. I don't know, but I would love to know how that happened. Yeah. So it's but yeah, no, you're certainly right. You're certainly right on the money, and if that's what you got from it.
That's the big thing that I admired most about the movie, is that it's a very specific, I mean, this is my assessment. It's a very specific vision of what cinema can be. Like, right. Again, rough around the edges, yet there's an honesty to it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I got from it mainly. That was what I took away from it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're exactly right. I'm glad to hear that, because the Peter and Joey, these, it also, it has a sense of humor, I mean, the fact that they would go to Toronto and Peter thinks that if he just goes into an advertising company, he could get a job. I mean, there's something funny about that, but yet also
Really
tragic,
sad.
really sad. But I'm always fascinated by innocent people who are really innocent, and because they're decent, hardworking guys, and they have every right to pursue whatever they want to do in their life. But they're just this is what happens. I mean, that they get bad breaks along the way, and even as Peter says to the guy at the advertising agency who's somewhat condescending towards him, when he says, hey, there's not much opportunity in the Maritimes, which is true, because the Maritimes even today is primarily blue collar province, and they've primarily opportunities in fishing and agriculture and things like that. I mean, they have a great art scene as well, but generally speaking, um, that those are the opportunities, and so these guys just want something else, and they don't know what it is. And as we see in the film, when they get there, it goes badly right away. Like, whoever, they were going to stay with these people who wouldn't let them stay, and then they have to go to the Salvation Army, and they end up doing jobs that kind of physical labor jobs, which is what they were doing back home. And so even though Joey, who's he's a little more along for the ride with Peter, it's unclear how if he has the same aspirations as Peter, and he's sort of more satisfied just because they're making more money than they used to. But Peter's like, I don't care. I want to do something I care about and be involved in something that he feels is important. But what, and so it's just it's fascinating, the relationships with the various women we see, how they take to them, um, and everything else. So yeah, I mean, I can watch it over and over again. It's it's a masterpiece in my view.
I do want to say, and I mean this respectfully, I do have to disagree with you on one point.
Go ahead.
I agree with you on that point, that they're innocent and that they have this innocent perspective. I don't think they're
Yeah.
decent. I don't think they're decent guys. I really don't think so, because and by the way, just to be clear, I do not think the film is sexist. I think they're sexist.
Right. I know what you. Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Like the cat calling, like they do,
Yeah.
like the women,
That's not what good guys would do.
Right. Oh no,
That's not.
you're not wrong. I mean, they
Yeah.
certainly have their share of flaws. Um, it's interesting because I was talking to Tom Ernst, who's another well-known critic here in Toronto. We were talking about this film, and that aspect of the film came up. It's like they objectify women, they catcall to women, which of course still exists. I think maybe generally speaking, I mean, obviously there's still a lot of toxic behavior from men, but I think generally speaking, men are more aware that that's inappropriate and objectifying of women. But at that time, catcalling to a woman, obviously it wasn't appropriate, but men didn't necessarily realize that was a bad thing.
They weren't thinking about it. They weren't thinking about it in the context of a woman as a human being who deserves respect.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, spoiler alert, of course, what they do in the end is horrible, because when they get into trouble, and Joey marries this woman, Betty, they get married, she's pregnant, and the cops are after them because they beat up this grocery store worker.
Maybe to death.
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah.
possibly to death, and they take off without her. And so yeah, you're right. I mean, it's they have their share of flaws, but I think it's done with the utmost empathy, because I don't know about you, but I never hate them. I just see it's human beings at their most desperate, and maybe not making the best choices, unfortunately.
I do have to say, whenever I see a film, I always or whenever I'm writing a film or something like that, I always try to think, well, what's the angle I want to attack this particular story from? And so I try to think what would be interesting to me. I would be more interested. I'm not interested particularly. I'd want to know what happens to these guys after they are running from the cops. That'd be the traditional story, but it's not my movie. So that's that because I really felt like the climactic scene, that was when I was interested. I was really interested in these two characters' dilemmas. Uh,
Well, it's interesting you say that, because
is
in
that fair?
2000,
Is that fair enough? Is that fair enough?
sure, yeah. I
Okay.
mean, if you were interested in, I'm also interested in what happens,
Yeah.
but I also like the fact that it ends and on loose ends.
Yeah.
It
Yeah. Yeah.
and really, it's about going after a dream, and the dream being destroyed.
Yeah.
And I think it, another comparison, maybe like Midnight Cowboy has a similar ending,
Yeah.
whereas that in some ways is more optimistic from Joe Buck's point of view.
Mm.
Not so much Ratso, who Hoffman plays, but in this case, it it ends badly, and I think this may be my own interpretation, but we, again, as I was saying off the top, you know like the American dream, the Canadian dream is similar, where we have this idea that we can do better than our parents economically, so long as we work hard and go to school, and we can be successful. And I know, the American dream is similar. However, there's truth to that, but it's ultimately too simplistic, because what if your Doug, Peter, and Joey, who are, you would imagine, are brought up in a blue collar environment, where people are not necessarily talking at home, communicating about various problems, different things happening, and you go to work and you go home, and so your whole life has been working blue collar jobs, and now, when you're in you because you haven't had perhaps that foundation of, and I don't mean education, formal education like going to school, but just uh educated in
Emotional education
yeah,
and
emotion, exactly,
self-awareness. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, because and now you're finding you want to do something else, you have this itch, and you pursue it. And how do these guys just go to school? Because even the advertising guy says, well, go to school if you want to be in advertising, and he's right. But you see how Peter's kind of like, he doesn't have the confidence to do that. I mean,
Mm.
he leaves that meeting, and you see him outside, and he looks like he's utterly failed. And so, if we're saying that anybody can do this, that's ultimately too simplistic, and it's
Yeah.
it's more for the privileged few,
Yeah.
who maybe have a lot of advantages. I'm not to say that there aren't great rag to riches stories, but I think these guys have that simplistic way of looking at things, and they think, well, I can work hard, I can go to Toronto, why won't you hire me? I've watched TV, I could work in advertising. And then what do they find? Like that, it's, life is not that life is not that simple. So I think the fact that it ends with them driving off, to me, is just, it's a perfect ending.
Yeah.
And because I think, you correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not American, but I think the American dream is something that, at least generally speaking, more people believe in, among the American population. And I think in Canada, this is just my own opinion, I think we're a little more skeptical
Mm.
of the Canadian dream, and I think this film shows that.
I cannot speak for America.
Yeah.
But I'm in San Francisco, and so
Right.
I feel like it's I love this city. I love living here, and also I feel like in San Francisco we see America and we're like we're gonna stay here. You know,
Right.
currently with what's going on. Uh,
Yeah.
but
Right.
yeah, that's my assessment anyway. Um,
Yeah. 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 And now, and now the American or even Canadian dream, what have you, is even more unattainable because people go to school. Even if you go to school, you come. I know Bernie Sanders, the politician, said this. It's like you walk out with your degree and your in one hand and your bankruptcy letter in the other.
yeah,
You
yeah,
know? So it's like it's and it. So this film again, to me, is sort of questioning
yeah.
that way of thinking. So
Let's go back for a moment to a point you touched on, which is Canadian cinema versus American cinema. You know how Japanese cinema has its own kind of language or its own kind of niche, like they had Kurosawa and Ozu, and meanwhile Russian cinema has Eisenstein, and then German cinema has Rainer Werner Fassbinder. Who would you say are the titans of Canadian cinema? Just for the reference point of the viewer, the listener.
well, it's so interesting because uh, I went on another podcast about a year and a half ago, and like as soon as we were talking about Canadian cinema, and we're all Canadians and love Canadian cinema, and the question simply was, "What's a Canadian film?" And we all hesitated, and that sort of
That
sums
was my
up,
question. That was my question. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you know, and I think that hesitation and that question mark sort of symbolizes a lot of the struggles we have, down to the fact that so much American film is and television is shot here that we then have to hide our city or make it look like something else. Um, and again, hey, at least there's a lot of film and TV production happening here, and there are a number of purely Canadian films and television shows. So since the '60s, it's certainly built. If we're talking, I know you're talking artistic, but if we look at it from an industry standpoint, yeah, there were more television shows than because they're really before the '60s. I can't think of any. I could be wrong, and of course there were more we had this period which they call the tax shelter days where companies could just make a movie and then write it off. So there was tons of purely Canadian films which wound up being a lot of crap, but every now and then there'd be something like The Silent Partner with Elliot Gould and Christopher Plummer, which is like this amazing neo-noir. So the industry certainly built. Quebec certainly. I mean, if you look back in this period in the '60s, there really was a French Canadian new wave. A lot of French Canadian movies, and they have like their own star system there and everything. But here it started with Going Down the Road and other movies, and it was never truly followed up on, and so everything's like a blur. But if we look at it, I mean, to me the titans really are someone like Donald Shabib, who I guess are the ones who didn't leave, because a lot of who we would consider titans have all left, and I don't blame them for leaving, because some of them, like Sidney Fury, felt that no one cared enough here, so he left. And then of course you had Norman Jewison. All these guys started here. Um, James Cameron. I don't know how much he did in Canada. So it's hard to say. Jean-Marc Vallée, also, he made this film called Crazy here, which is like a phenomenal film. And he also went and then did Wild with Reese Witherspoon, and
Dallas
he's a
Buyers Club.
fantastic. Yeah, Dallas Buyers Club. He's Canadian, French Canadian. And then you have Denis. I always get his
Villeneuve.
last name wrong. Yeah, he's again an amazing Canadian filmmaker. And of course, I understand they want to work with bigger budgets. They want to do different things. Who would say no? But then you get someone like Sarah Polley who didn't leave, right? And she won an Oscar last year. And so now we get like these co-pros more often, like that film she did, Women Talking. I could be wrong. I don't think it was purely Canadian financed. So people find ways to make their films. But I mean, to me, Sarah Polley, certainly, Shabib, who made this, Don Owen is another. He didn't make too many narratives, but his movies like The Ernie Game, which was also the National Film Board. He was incredible filmmaker. Also didn't go to the States. So there's several, but it's hard. It's hard to pick, because then how do I leave out Jean-Marc Vallée just because he left? It's so again, it's always just like with everything Canadian. It's always who's the best Canadian or who's one of the best. It's always that question mark, because it falls in the shades of gray in a lot of ways.
Slightly off topic, I'm assuming you've seen the Every Frame Painting video, Vancouver Never Plays Itself.
I think so. Why does that ring a bell?
Every Frame a Painting. It basically it's assessing why, like, it's basically a critique of Hollywood disguising Vancouver.
Oh God, how have I not seen that? I know that title rings a bell, so I'll have to.
I'll send it to you right after this.
Yeah, please do.
Hi, listeners. Just wanted to briefly hop on this episode to remind you that the Indiegogo campaign for my feature-length film debut, Structure, is now live. So if you'd like this episode, please consider donating to the campaign. Link in the description. All right, thank you so much, and back to the episode with Robert Bellissimo. So back to the film. Do you have any insights into the making of the film, or do you know if there was any improvisation on the part of the actors? I know we mentioned the people on the street scene earlier.
You know what? I'm not sure. Okay. There's a Jeff Pavir, who I mentioned earlier, who I interviewed, one of our great critics. He wrote a book about the making of this.
Oh wow!
Which I haven't read yet, and he also did the commentary on the. This is actually it's not on Blu-ray yet, but it was restored in 2011 and it was put on DVD. And he did the commentary track, which I still haven't heard. So I'm not as familiar with the actual making of it, other than the fact that the NFB funded it. And this was that period where they were more interested in getting into narrative features. But apart from that, I don't know a lot about the making of it, but if people are interested, like I said, there's the book, the commentary from Jeff Pavir on the DVD, or I'm sure there are articles about it as well.
Why is Goin Down the Road not as well known as A Woman Under the Influence, Faces? Why? I mean, you have said it's a masterpiece.
Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, Canada is always, if you're interested in Canadian cinema, you just got to go look, but they don't necessarily pop out to you. Like if you're a film person and you type in greatest films ever made for film buffs, what comes up? Cassavetes, Godard, Truffaut, Agnes Varda, French New Wave, Fassbinder, German New Wave, Italian neorealism, De Sica, all that stuff comes up. Canadians, for whatever, it just doesn't just go to you. You just got to go to it. So it's hard to answer why has it been neglected? I don't know. I mean, commercially speaking, at the time, it actually did quite well.
Oh, really? I didn't know.
Yeah, okay. It did. Yeah. It did quite well. There's also an interview people could find on YouTube with Donald Shabib that he did with the CBC, talking about the film. But there and now there's a Blu-ray company here in Canada called Canadian International Pictures, and they are restoring various Canadian films and putting them on Blu-ray, and they've done a wonderful, wonderful job. And a lot of things they've been putting out I hadn't heard of. It was great. Recently, Tracy Letts went on a physical media podcast and gave it a shout out, which was great to see. So I don't know. We just, again, it's an opportunity for people like me and others to shine a light. Right? Um, there's always great films that are ignored, or maybe people now haven't heard of, that we'll find, down the road. Oh, don't going down
Yeah,
the
yeah,
road.
yeah. Well done. Were there other aspects of the film you wanted to touch on?
Well, the relation, the one thing that I found that it popped out to me on this last viewing that I found interesting was with the women. With Jane Eastwood is the woman who gets pregnant in
Mhm.
it, um, and we don't get as much of her perspective about how she feels about having to marry Joey, how she feels about having a baby. She's just with them, but every now and then you'll notice he'll cut to her face and he'll hang on it. And even at the wedding, she looks unhappy. And so I found that interesting. And then at the same time, we see that that other friend of hers who Joey is hoping Peter will like so that they can, all hang out, and he doesn't like her. And he says that she's talking too much and all this kind of stuff. And what's interesting is that I think that those women remind them of women that they knew in the Maritimes. And I think Peter that's why he's rejecting her. And if you look at they go to that record store on Yonge Street, and he sees this pretty woman buying a record, and so he buys it because he's always looking for something different, something that he considers perhaps more sophisticated, or even superior to his knowledge. She buys a record, so he buys it. Same with the very pretty woman at the where they work at the factory, who has a position above them, and to them she seems unattainable, but he has the courage to ask her out. And again, my heart went out for him when he went out with her, and she was dancing with someone else, and the date goes badly, and then he takes her home, and of course he's hoping to sleep with her, and his friends are outside, you know kind of cheering him on, hoping that he's, getting laid or what have you. And he leaves, and he knows that they're there. He waits in the door stoop until they leave, so that they'll think he's up there with her, which is so juvenile. And yes, it is sort of treating these women like objects and stuff. But on the flip side, it says a
There's
lot
a
about.
sadness to it.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. On the flip side, these things say a lot about them, and particularly Peter, what he wants out of life and what he's looking for. So I found that fascinating. Just everything, just the rawness of it, just those moments, the observational moments of just when things are going so bad and they have no money and they get fired, they get let go at that job at the factory, and just seeing them not be able to sleep at night. With now they're in this terrible apartment, people screaming outside the window, seeing them throw things in the pond. And you see the looks on their faces are just one of desperation and utter despair. Um, yeah, I mean, I just wanted to mention that, because that really popped out to me in this last viewing. I don't know if that was your experience.
Just to yes and what you're saying, and to go back to another point, I believe there is a big difference between a movie being sexist and the characters being sexist, or
Right.
bigoted or what have you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just to be clear, I am not saying this movie is sexist. I'm
Yeah.
saying the
Yeah.
characters are sexist, and so therefore,
Of course. Yeah.
and so that's why I said earlier, these aren't great. These aren't the best guys. Final thoughts on the film.
Well, I mean, if people haven't seen it and um you're in Canada, you could, because it was funded by the NFB, we can see it for free on their streamer, the NFB streamer. But for some reason it is not on their streamer. I don't know why. It may be because I think CBC also put some funding in it, so maybe that has something to do with that. I always hate to tell people to find like things on YouTube that are there for free.
Yeah, me too.
It is on there for free, but it's not the restored version. So it's a pretty bad copy, but you can at least see it. But there is also the DVD, which was restored, like I said, in the 2010 or 11, which also has the sequel. There was a sequel made in 2011. I heard about this, yeah. Yeah, which I still haven't seen. So if you're like Andrew is interested in what happens after that car ride, we see it, and I guess they certainly must get into it in
right
in the sequel. But again, I think to drive the point home, if Canadian cinema is totally unfamiliar with you, if you like Italian neorealism, French New Wave, that Doc Cassavetes, Shirley Clark, these kind of filmmakers who that observational, rough, gritty style of filmmaking, you'll certainly like a movie like this.
Robert Bellissimo, my last two questions for you are: where can people follow you, and what do you have to promote?
So my YouTube channel is youtube.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies. And you can find all of my social media handles as well as the YouTube channel on my Linktree page. So just go to linktree.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies. And I do a weekly video every Sunday. Occasionally, I may do a bonus episode during the week, but primarily it's every Sunday there's a new episode. And that can be a film review similar to what Andrew and I are doing right now, or it's an interview with someone in the film industry talking about their experiences in a particular film or their career in general. And the other thing I do is a lot of interviews with writers about their various film books. So today I just released one with John DeLeo. He wrote a book called Not Even Nominated, and it's 40 overlooked. I'm probably getting the title. It's a bit of a long title, but it's basically about performances that were overlooked by the Oscars. When someone in a film won Best Actor or Actress, let's say, and their co-star wasn't even nominated. So he explores not necessarily why that was, but how it's sort of kind of insane.
Yeah.
But it's not. The interesting thing about the book is it's not like an Oscar love fest, because I don't agree with awards. I'm not a big award person, but he has a fascination for the Oscars, but at the same time acknowledges that they're absurd. So if they're impossible to ignore. I mean, it's like the Oscar time of year. So, if we're not going to ignore them, then let's talk about them. And so that's what the book is primarily shining a light on, performances that maybe you haven't seen, or maybe thinking about them in a different context. So that's the new episode. That's out today. Today's Sunday, so it's out now.
That sounds like a fantastic episode. I'm really looking forward to watching it. And if you can send me those links, like the links, I'll include that in the show notes. Everything you want me to include,
oh, great.
Everything you want to promote. So listeners, viewers, please look in the show notes for all of Robert's links. Robert Bellissimo, thank you so much for being on Behind the Flicks. I hope you'll come back.
Well, yeah, I'll certainly come back. It's been great talking to you, Andrew, and thanks so much for having me.
Listeners, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for future episodes, feel free to shoot us an email at independentcareerstudios@gmail.com. If you like this episode, feel free to write a review and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spotify, or YouTube. We'd love to hear your feedback. Behind the Flicks was created by myself and Ariana. I edited this episode. My name is Aaron Gentile. This has been Independent Career Studios production.